Let's move on to our next segment, brought to you by one of our bold partners, Independent Women's Forum. This week we have Julie Gunlock with us via Skype. She is the director for the Center for Progress and Innovation at IWF. Welcome, Julie.
Thanks for having me.
Julie, you recently wrote an article for the Washington Examiner on the rise of opioid addiction in teenagers and young adults. So why is it that you think that so many young people are using opioids?
Well, it's a tragic situation, and I don't know that they're necessarily using them for any other reason but for recovering from injury. We see that sports are on the rise, competitive sports are on the rise, and as a result, injuries are increasing, and many of those injuries require surgery to recover. And many of the kids that get surgery to recover receive opioids as part of that recovery, and they end up having a hard time getting off of them. If any of the listeners here have been on opioids, I certainly have been for recovering from C-sections. I had 3 children by C-section, and it is tough. It's tough to get off of them, and it's clear with the increase of sports and the increase of injuries due to those sports. Sports, even at the high school level, have become very competitive. There's a lot of injuries, and so many times kids get on them because they need them. They need to recover from these injuries, and then as they're recovering, they can't quite get off of them, and they turn to sort of the black market for these drugs. The other thing that we've seen is that teens tend to mix opioids with other drugs and alcohol, which is why we have a very high rate of overdose and death due to opioids. If you mix opioids with other drugs and alcohol, it's extremely dangerous. So it's a real critical issue, and I think parents need to be aware of it.
Yeah, I mean, I was really surprised in your article. You talked about that surgeries for sports-related injuries among young athletes went up 55% from 2006 to 2013. I mean, that's an enormous spike. So I can see why there's a lot of concern here. And by the way, my hat's off to you, Julie. 3 kids by cesarean. I mean, I was
actually thinking the same thing.
God bless you. Like those kids,
yes.
they better treat you well.
I'm actually in New Orleans giving a speech, and so I'm in a hotel room, and I'm so happy to be alone with no interruptions, no BBC moments. Look, it is, and look, I'm also a mother of 3 boys, and I'm really thrilled. 2 of my boys are one is not very sports oriented. 2 of them are, and one is incredibly competitive. And so, in the back of my mind, I think about this. I mean, he really pushes himself so hard, and I think parents of especially sports-minded kids need to realize that this is a true risk.
Well, and Julie, you talk about the symptoms that parents should watch for. Tell us about those symptoms for our viewers.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's so funny. I actually put in my article that, grouchiness and exhaustion and sort of like looking off into into space are some of the signs. And I'm like,
isn't that just being a teenager? Really?
Right, exactly. And I wrote that in my article. I'm like, you might not notice these, but you need to be aware of sweating, of red eyes, of other things. Look, also, and I think most parents of sports-minded kids will recognize this. Sports-minded kids tend to be very driven. They're very focused. If you see your sports-minded kid suddenly lose focus, suddenly become less driven, these are signs.
If he starts to listen to emo music like Death Cab for Cutie after previously being sports-minded, red flag.
Right. So these are things. And also, look, I want to say also in a lot of these conversations about how we deal with this, the solutions. A lot of conversations about how do we solve the opioid crisis. Parents are so often left out of it, but they are key. They are key to helping, 1, prevent it, and 2, helping seek out services and treatment for kids.
Well, and Julie, that's what you said in the article, that you said that studies show that parents who are very proactive in saying that drug use is bad, it's wrong, it's negative, then their kids are less likely to do drugs. So why are some parents reluctant to do that? Is it that they worry that maybe it might have the reverse effect, or are they just maybe more lackadaisical? Maybe they don't want to be perceived as controlling. Why would a parent not be so proactive about this?
Well, look, we know that in this country, people might have their own issues. They might have their own issues with alcohol. They might have their own issues with substance abuse. And I think, as you mentioned, some parents just don't want to talk about it, right? They find these things just sort of tough to talk about. You've got to talk about these issues with your kids. But more importantly, before this is even an issue, I have my oldest is 11. You might think, well, why are you even worried about this? I'm very worried about this, and I talk to my kids about controlled substances and how these can really take over your life. I have set a standard at this age that this is a scary thing out there that we have to be careful of, and that you can become hooked. It can change your life. I think that everyone talks about what's the appropriate age to talk about sex, and oh gosh, should I? There's another question people should be asking, and what is the appropriate age to be talking about drug abuse and opioid abuse? Mm-hmm. I say the minute they start into sports, you should be talking about these things. You should be talking about how these things can really affect them. So I've started to talk about it with my kids. I believe in open conversations with your kids about these things. And I think also parents need to be aware that their behaviors, if they abuse alcohol, if they drink alcohol in front of their children, and I'm not talking about, I have a 1 or 2 glasses of wine while I cook dinner. That is not what I'm talking about. But if you abuse drugs, or if you abuse alcohol, your kids are going to see that. Ultimately, you are the ultimate influence on your children.
Julie, I agree, and I think one of the biggest problems with the opioid epidemic is that there is a purpose for opioids, right? It is necessary, and it does solve an existing problem of pain. So how do you manage the fact that people are going to go through injury, and people have that they are prone to that, particularly in sports with teenagers, and the addiction part of it?
Well, Alice, I'm so glad that you brought that up, because what's lost in these conversations so often about opioids is that opioids have allowed so many people who live with chronic pain, cancer patients who are dealing with serious diseases, to live fairly normal lives and get on with their life and actually work and do errands and do things that they need to do in their daily life. Opioids are incredibly useful for people who are dealing with serious diseases. And so that's lost often. We tend to say, opioids are all bad, or anything is all bad or all good. Opioids have a purpose. They're very useful. We should give doctors the ability to continue to give out opioids if they are necessary and at their discretion. But I think parents need to be aware of this issue. Parents need to sort of head this off. And parents also need to be aware, especially if their kids are in sports, that this could develop into a problem, and that their child won't only use opioids. They will mix the opioids with other drugs or alcohol to get that high that they need. That is the truly dangerous thing. I mean, opioids abuse alone is very dangerous, but the mixing is really scary. And so I think just the awareness, I think parents talking to their kids about this, if their child experiences a sports injury, tell them that we've got to wean you off this on the timeline that the doctor has determined, and we need to abide by that. And watching your child, watching for those signs. Again, parents also, if they have, I've had, I said I had the C-sections, but I've also had a back surgery, I had a knee surgery. I know I sound like I'm about to drop dead, but I always wean myself off early, and then I get the opioids out of my medicine cabinet. Get your medicine out of your medicine cabinet, especially if you have teens. They will, kids who get hooked on this stuff, and I mentioned in my article, they will often get medicine from family medicine cabinets. So it's very important that you rid your house of those medicines.
Excellent advice.
Great.
Thanks so much, Julie Gunlock.
Thank you for all your work as well, Julie.
Thanks for having me.
Good luck in New Orleans. Safe travels.